Welcome to Time with Death. This video is for informational purposes and in no way meant to glorify or condone violence. In today's video, we'll be discussing the murder of Miguel Trejo. Trejo was killed on Sunday, June 8, 2003, in the 2000 block of East 76th Place in the Florence-Firestone neighborhood of South Central LA, according to LA County coroner records. Jesus Ortega Cisneros, Alberto Hernandez, Armando Salmon, and Ruben Servin were subsequently arrested and charged with the murder. The following is the evidence at trial. Gerald Altamirano, a friend of defendant Cisneros, testified to the events of June 7 and early morning hours of June 8, 2003. Altamirano knew defendant Hernandez by the name of Chavo and as defendant Cisneros' friend. Altamirano also knew defendant Salmon and had previously been to defendant Servin's house. On the evening of June 7, Altamirano was with defendant Cisneros when Cisneros received a phone call to pick up defendant Hernandez and the victim, whom Altamirano had seen several times previously with defendants Hernandez and Salmon. Initially, they seemed friendly. They arrived at defendant Servin's house at about 11 p.m., and defendant Hernandez ordered them all out of the car. Defendant Servin opened the gate, and they went into the backyard where there was a shed and three men unknown to Altamirano. Defendant Servin closed the gate behind them, and then the victim and defendant Hernandez went into the shed, along with defendant Cisneros and the three unknown men, who seemed to go into the shed voluntarily. Altamirano remained standing next to a tree in the backyard. From where he stood at the tree, Altamirano heard sounds coming from inside the shed of someone being punched and knocked to the floor. Then he heard more punches, screaming and moaning, and duct tape being pulled from the roll. He heard defendant Hernandez calling the victim bad words and asking in Spanish where the marijuana that had been stolen from him could be found. Altamirano recognized the victim's voice replying in Spanish that he didn't know what defendant Hernandez was talking about. Altamirano then heard a gunshot from inside the shed, and defendant Salmon ran out of the shed, approached Altamirano, handed him a black gun, and said, "Hold it." When Altamirano asked whether there was something wrong with it, defendant Salmon nodded and said he had just shot it. Altamirano put the gun in the engine compartment of a car that was in the backyard, and defendant Salmon returned to the shed. Altamirano and others drank beer as he waited outside for about 45 minutes to an hour while the victim was being beaten in the shed. After about half an hour, the victim began giving information the drugs were at his uncle's house in Alhambra. Altamirano and defendants then went to Southgate to pick up a van and the van's owner. When they returned to defendant Servin's house, defendant Hernandez went into the shed and Altamirano heard the victim giving directions. Defendant Hernandez came out and said, "Let's go." Altamirano, defendants, and the van's owner went to an apartment complex near a church in Alhambra. Upon arrival, everyone but defendant Salmon and Altamirano got out and went to an upstairs apartment in the back. Defendant Hernandez and one of the others had guns. They returned about 20 minutes later angry. They drove around, stopping at a gas station and then a 7-Eleven store, while defendant Hernandez spoke to defendant Servin several times on his cell phone speaker. Defendant Hernandez told defendant Servin the victim was lying about the address as no one opened the door. Altamirano could hear defendant Servin questioning the victim, who, sounding hurt, told him that it was the truth and that his uncle was there and that he or defendant Servin could call to confirm. The group returned to the apartment complex and Altamirano again stayed in the van. Defendant Salmon came back before the others, stood outside the van for several minutes, looked around, and then returned upstairs when a police car drove by. They then all returned to the van with luggage that smelled of marijuana. Defendant Hernandez said they had taken money and tied up the person inside and put a plastic bag over his head. They stopped at a 7-Eleven store, put the guns in the back part of the van, then went to defendant Salmon's apartment in Southgate where he and defendant Hernandez left the bags of marijuana. Defendant Hernandez called defendant Servin and asked, "Is he still alive?" Defendant Hernandez looked angry when told the victim was alive and said he was going to finish him off. Back at defendant Servin's house, Altamirano remained in the van while the others went into the backyard and out of sight. Defendant Servin returned and backed up the van to the shed. The van owner said that he had to leave and drove the van away. Defendant Hernandez backed his Toyota into the yard close to the shed's door. Defendants Hernandez and Servin went into the shed, then defendant Servin ran to his house. Defendant Hernandez called Altamirano from the door of the shed to come help him. Altamirano went to the shed door and saw the victim, who looked dead. The victim was upside down, hands bound behind his back with green paint on him. His head and body were covered with blood that was all over the floor of the shed. Altamirano refused to help with the body, and Defendant Hernandez said something like, "Don't be a coward." As Defendant Hernandez rolled the victim into a blanket, Altamirano left. A minute or two later, defendants brought the body out wrapped in the blanket and took it to the back of the Toyota. When a sheriff's car pulled up, they dropped the body, and Defendant Hernandez exclaimed in Spanish something about being in trouble. Everybody started running. Altamirano saw Defendant Hernandez and Defendant Cisneros jump a fence, and Defendant Servin run along the side of the house to the street. Defendant Servin's longtime next-door neighbor testified that her bedroom was about 5 or 6 feet away from the shed. On the night of June 7, 2003, she went to sleep around 11 p.m. and was awakened later by a man's voice saying, "Give me water, I'm burning," in Spanish. He also said, "Help, forgive me, God, for what I've done, undo the handcuff." She also heard the man give an address in Alhambra. His voice was muffled and he spoke with difficulty. The neighbor went back to sleep and woke up again around 5 or 6 a.m. After leaving for a short time, she returned and saw a white car with the trunk open. Kicking sounds were coming from the shed along with a complaining sound. She saw several men near the car, which was close to the shed. She then called the police. Medical examiner Daryl Garber performed the autopsy on the victim's body. He found extensive facial swelling as well as bruises, contusions, and lacerations on his face, extremities, and torso. A gunshot wound from a bullet that passed through the lower right leg, fracturing the tibia, was observed. Abrasions and scratches found on his neck were consistent with ligature-type strangulation. The victim suffered what appeared to be separate blows to the head from a blunt instrument with a relatively sharp edge, large enough and heavy enough to cause a straight linear cut that penetrated the full thickness of the scalp. Numerous blows resulted in additional facial swelling and bruises on the right side of the victim's chin. On his forehead, right eyebrow, and right upper cheek, there were 4 or 5 linear or elongated lacerations that were almost parallel, going through the full thickness of his skin, and in some cases reaching the bone. The victim was intoxicated at the time of his death, having ingested methamphetamine and cocaine. There was also acetone in his blood and urine, which is consistent with paint thinner, most likely inhaled. The cause of death was ligature strangulation, which occluded the blood supply to the head. Dr. Garber testified it could take several minutes of sustained compression to occlude the airway and several more minutes after a victim lost consciousness for death to occur. Dr. Garber was unable to identify the exact time of death, but from the facts taken from the coroner's investigation report, he opined with some degree of acceptance within the medical community that the time of death was probably between midnight of June 7th and 8 a.m. on June 8th. Following the trial, in 2004, defendants Jesus Ortega Cisneros, Alberto Hernandez, Armando Salmon, and Ruben Servin were convicted of first-degree murder, torture, and second-degree robbery. The court sentenced each defendant to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 11 years. Miguel Trejo Hernandez was 25 years old at the time of death.